militarily, China, by building these artificial airstrips and harbors, could help China to project its military power in the region, especially to counter a possible U.S. encirclement along the first island chain. And strategically, lots of people see the South China Sea as China's backyard, especially with the nearby Southeast Asia region, where China wants to expand its political influence.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Statz, and I'm the Director for East Asia and Pacific Programs at the United States Institute of Peace. And on behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, a discussion with a wonderful title, How a Rusting Warship Became the Hotspot of the South China Sea. Now, as most of you know, China's sovereignty claims in the South China Sea have long been a point of contention and friction for many countries in the region, for the United States, and for countless others. And recently, Second Thomas Shoal specifically has emerged as an important hotspot in the South China Sea, or the West Philippine Sea, as it is known in the Philippines. Both China and the Philippines claim sovereignty over this area, and we've seen several near crises around the Second Thomas Shoal over the last year. And just this week, we had another incident at sea, which was witnessed firsthand by journalists on board. The situation is getting more tense and more dangerous, and we have two fantastic experts here with us today to help us make sense of what has been going on and what it means for the region and the world. First, we have Frances Wong. She's an assistant professor of political science at Colgate University, and she was previously an assistant professor at the Singapore Management University and a postdoctoral fellow at Notre Dame. Her forthcoming book looks at how China uses media statecraft in its foreign conflicts. And our second expert is Jay Batongbakal, who's a professor at the University of the Philippines College of Law and the director of the Institute of Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea at the UP Law Center. He's also a lawyer who has worked extensively on maritime affairs for over 25 years. Frances and Jay, thank you so much for being with us today. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to just dive right in. And Frances, we'll start with you. Before we get into the specifics of what happened this week, can you help us just back up a little bit and understand how we got here? Can you tell us about the history behind Second Thomas Shoal, South China Sea, and why the Philippines and China both care so much about this?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here for this interesting discussion. So the dispute dates back to the year 1999 when the Philippines Navy sent its naval ship Sierra Madre to deliberately run aground near the shoal and marooned it at the feature. So it became a permanent outpost to station a few Philippine Marines on the ship. The Chinese protested at the beginning, especially when the Philippine side give the explanation that it was there because of a malfunction, and it promised to tow away the ship, but never kept its promise. So that's China's complaint. And after that became more of a matter of resupply missions. The Chinese permitted resupplies of water and food, sometimes through ships or airdrops. But when it comes to construction materials to fortify or reinforce the ship, that the Chinese they intercepted, and these recent flare-ups, especially last year, starting from the last year, in February there was a use of military-grade laser shined on the Filipino Coast Guards and caused temporary blindness. And there were a few incidents in which water cannons were used against the Philippines Coast Guards. So the Second Thomas Shoal was important for the Philippines because it lies within the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone from the Philippine Coast Guard coastal line. So maintaining the ship would mean to keep a physical presence of the Philippines in the area and assert the Filipino sovereignty in the area. And it's important for China, more from a broader context of the strategic value of the South China Sea to China. Economically, that 50% of the, 40% of the world's merchandise and 25% of the world's gas and oil traverses through the South China Sea. And militarily, China, by building these artificial airstrips and harbors, could help China to project its military power in the region, especially to counter a possible US encirclement along the first island chain. And strategically, lots of people see the South China Sea as China's backyard, especially with the nearby Southeast Asia region, where China wants to expand its political influence.
Great. Thank you so much. Jay, we're going to come to you in just a minute to talk about what happened this week. But before we do, Francis, I wondered if you could just say a quick word about July 2016 and the International Tribunal that ruled on the South China Sea in general and overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines. Can you tell us a little bit about the tribunal and its decision and specifically how it addressed Second Thomas Shoal?
Yes, of course. So the international generally considers the shoal to be low tide elevation, so that the shoal in itself doesn't confer any maritime rights. The arbitral tribunal in 2016, because based on the fact that the shoals lies within the Philippines EEZ, that the tribunal ruled that the Philippines has a right to carry out economic activities near the shoal in the area, including constructing features on the shoal. It also ruled that China's ambitious 9-line claim in the South China Sea does not have a legal basis. And because of that China doesn't really have a right to carry out these law enforcement operations in the area. But from China's perspective, as argued that the Philippines' initial marooning of the ship in the area is a violation of the Declaration of Conduct Parties in the South China Sea, which, the DOC, which bans on the inhabiting of the then occupied features in the area. But to Philippines' defense, that the grounding of the Sierra Madre happened before the signing of the DOC. And the Chinese also argued they've taken a generally non-acceptance, non-participation position on the arbitration case. They said that the Philippines unilaterally submitting this case violates the spirit of the DOC in favoring bilateral negotiations to peacefully resolve the dispute. And they argued that the Philippines submitted this unilaterally, not in a good faith, to resolve the dispute. They've also made other arguments to question the authority of the arbitral tribunal in making judgments on the maritime rights, without discussing the sovereignty rights. And they've also questioned the neutrality of the tribunal from the financial sources of the tribunal.
Great, thank you very much. Obviously, this 2016 ruling did not resolve the issue for the parties involved. So Jay, I'm wondering now to turn to you, if you could tell us a little bit about the news of the day, the front page headlines this week. What has been happening around Second Thomas Shoal over the last year, but especially earlier this week, that is causing people to be so concerned?
Yes, Jennifer, thank you. Before I go into that, I'd just like to add a little bit more detail to add context to the story that Francis has very ably narrated. No? While the Philippines marooned that ship there in 1999, this was actually in response to China's taking of Mischief Reef, which was only about 15 to 25 nautical miles away. So it was directly to try to establish that outpost because of the perception in the Philippines that China was intruding into the Philippine EEZ. And they did it first in 1992, after acceding to the original 1992 South China Sea Code of Conduct between the ASEAN members. And then they renovated it and expanded the facility in 1999. So the grounding the Sierra Madre was in direct response to that. And that is why for the Philippines, no, at the time it didn't have much resources. It had no other means other than to ground the ship in order to establish that presence in the area. Now, China has found and probably is monitoring very closely. They know that the ship, having been there for such a long time, is probably in serious disrepair and about to collapse. And that's probably the reason why they have increased the pressure around the Second Thomas Shoal to keep us from actually repairing that ship. They've also increased this pressure, particularly after the South China Sea arbitration proceedings had already been initiated. So it's clearly something, it's clearly also a reaction to the judgment now. What is happening now is that that pressure has continued to build up, and it has escalated again in a way. It all started in 2013 when they were just interfering with the resupply mission by preventing the vessel from reaching the area. But now, not only that, they're also deploying large numbers of ships, no, Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels this time, and actively interfering with the approach of these vessels, even using water cannon in this latest incident, no? They've also been able to instigate a collision with one of the with one of the Coast Guard vessels that was escorting our supply vessels. No, so this is again an incremental escalation, because it went from radio warnings to just dangerous maneuvers, but still a little bit of distance, to actual grazing now in collisions. And then they also started using these laser and then reportedly an acoustic weapon. And now it's directly using water cannon to blast the resupply vessels themselves. And as we've seen from the latest news, these water cannons are no joke. They broke through the glass of the pilot house and caused some injuries inside the vessel. And so now the Chinese are again insisting that these activities are supposedly professional and lawful, but that's really from the perspective of an illegitimate claim to sovereignty over this area. And the Philippines, however, insists that Second Thomas Shoal being a low tide elevation, it is part of our EEZ and continental shelf, and we have every right to do what we need to do there, including to establish and maintain this outpost. It has become a symbolic issue, because in a way, if we were to lose if we were to lose Second Thomas Shoal, number one, it is like a complete it will completely undermine the arbitration itself. No? Because one of the key rulings of the arbitration is that this area belongs to the Philippines. So if it is taken away from us, that has serious implications on the nature of the arbitration and its legal effect and value, and it has serious implications for international law in general. And also, it is like a line in the sand in a way for the Philippines, because Second Thomas Shoal is the closest reef now that is occupied by the Philippines to the province of Palawan. So if the Chinese were to acquire that somehow, if they were able to kick us out of that shoal and then take over the reef, that's like stepping even closer now to Philippine shores. And that has serious political implications, not only for the claim, but the claim and jurisdiction of the Philippines over the EEZ, but also for the administration itself, which has declared quite strongly that it will not lose an inch, so-called, of the Philippines' territories and jurisdictions in the West Philippine Sea.
Great, thank you. That was a really rich history of a very complicated past few decades, and a very, as I said, a very exciting week as well. Obviously, this is a really important issue to both China and the Philippines, and their tensions are likely to remain high. I don't think we've seen the end of encounters at sea over Second Thomas Shoal, but China and Philippines have a much broader relationship. They're neighbors. There's a lot of trade. They've got diplomatic relations. What does this tension or this conflict over Second Thomas Shoal mean more broadly for the China-Philippines relationship? I guess I'll open it up to both of you to chime in on that. Maybe Francis, go to you first.
All right. So I want to add first, on the a little bit on the status of the ship, that it's been stationed there for 25 years. Dilapidated as an understatement for its conditions. So basically, the Chinese is waiting for it to crumble by interfering in intercepting a lot of these resupply ships. And if it crumbles, then the few Marine stationed there has to retreat from the area. Then the Philippines does lose a outpost to assert its sovereignty in the area. Regarding the overall bilateral relationship between China and the Philippines, fortunately, we haven't really seen anything major setback, especially in diplomatic relationships. Although in the past, China had initiated economic sanctions on the Philippines. For example, the 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff between the two countries, that China allegedly initiated a banana ban based on alleged past problems. And Chinese tourism to Philippines was also dampened significantly. So far, we haven't really seen anything similar. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese is not going to do that. But I've seen media reports by the Chinese state media trying to explain why economic sanctions is not the right policy in this case. So I'm hopeful that that's not in the playbook on the Chinese side.
Great. Jay, you want to weigh in on this?
Yes. Yeah. Well, overall, Philippine-China relations, other than those that deal with the West Philippine Sea, have been cordial and continuing. In terms of the economic relations, certainly there hasn't been any action taken on either side, which would indicate that there is some kind of constriction or retaliatory action, shall we say, no? And it has been pointed out that even before this, when tensions between the Philippines and China flared over the issues there in the West Philippine Sea, Philippine-China trade remained at more or less the same consistent level. And so even the reported sanctions against the Philippines by putting pressure on the banana trade in 2012, even that was debated in a way whether it was an actual economic lever that China tried to use, no? But in the end, it didn't actually have much of an effect on the Philippines because the Philippines simply transferred markets, no? And I think for now, generally, our economic relations are, well, unlike our ASEAN neighbors, they're still much more diverse, so that even if China were to try to use economic leverage against the Philippines, it probably would not have as much effect, no? It might hurt, but as some of our economists pointed out, it is survivable and we can find other partners. And this is true, especially in terms of like overseas development assistance, direct foreign investments. Our traditional partners, the US and Japan, still are number one, no, compared to China when it comes to that. No, it's really in the trade that China is number one. But then when you look at what is being traded, it's more of China getting raw materials from the Philippines and the Philippines buying products and processed goods from China. So in a way, it really would not impact heavily, no, on the Philippine economy if they were to try to use any kind of economic leverage. So probably that's one reason why that has not been resorted to. And instead, China has been trying to mold the narrative, no? Especially in the public sphere, in social media and in the traditional media. China instead has been working very hard to try to portray the Philippines as simply being without agency and doing all of this on the behest of the United States, completely ignoring the fact that the Philippines does have its own interests here, especially when it comes to the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, because we're talking about fishery and petroleum resources that are being denied by the Philippines by China's actions.
Thanks. And you touched on something in terms of the way this is resonating domestically in both countries, which is obviously a really big consideration for the governments as they try to think about how to respond to this. Francis, you're an expert on China's media statecraft. Jay mentioned it a little bit, but can you say a little bit more about how the Chinese media is portraying this situation, both domestically, internationally, what the Chinese public thinks about what's going on right now at Second Thomas Shoal?
The Chinese public generally supports the government position on this. At times that, especially since this issue has become more and more publicized in China and in the Philippines internationally, that we've seen nationalistic sentiment expressed, especially on social media, even complaining that the Chinese government's behavior is being too weak and being bullied by the Philippines, complaining about the interference of the United States. In terms of the state media content, as you can imagine that from the Chinese perspective, that they are pushing out arguments that it is the Philippines who's encroaching on the Chinese territorial integrity and condemning the United States for interfering into a territorial dispute that the US does not take a part in, has a part in. But notably that I've observed that compared to past media campaigns, that there isn't much of a media campaign to say about the recent flare-ups. The Chinese media reporting on the recent flare-ups have been, comparatively speaking, measured and much scripted. So most of the reporting on this have been just reposting of the official statements by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, or one time by the Chinese Coast Guard spokesperson. So this implies a measured preference for the Chinese government to not invoke further nationalist sentiment. So that might push their hands if they were to pursue a moderate foreign policy in the future.
Great, thanks. Jay, I'll come to you now to talk a little bit about how this is playing domestically in the Philippines. Obviously, there's been a lot of political change in the Philippines, so there's, I'm sure, a domestic politics angle to this as well as public opinion. Can you just tell us a little bit about, again, how this is playing out inside the Philippines?
Yes, well, as you know, in the previous president, had a very accommodating policy towards China, to the point that they were actually suppressing news and information about events in the West Philippine Sea, especially concerning these particular incidents. The new president, President Marcos, has taken a totally different track, to the surprise of many of us as well. And instead engage in what they called a transparency initiative, starting next year. And I think it was a reaction really to the fact that despite all of the accommodations given by the previous administration, China still kept moving in towards the Philippine coast. And our fishermen were already really complaining. They were feeling the Chinese pressure very close now to the coastline, and they practically were running out of fishing grounds. And in fact, some of them contacted me personally and asked for my help directly to give them some capacity building in order to understand what was going on. So I think during the election, this issue became a hot topic for the one who won it now, President Marcos, such that he changed the track, At first, during the campaign, we thought he would just parrot the Duterte position, but midstream during the campaign, he changed it completely. And since that time, he has taken this very forward-leaning posture and very strong posture when it comes to protecting and asserting Philippine rights and entitlements in the West Philippine Sea. This happens to be consistent with public opinion. Even during the Duterte administration, despite his accommodation with China, public opinion was dead set against him. And now, with the Marcos administration, that public opinion has simply been, he has responded to it and is now acting consistently with what the public wants. So now the transparency policy of the government, which is to immediately inform the people of what is going on and to allow them immediate access to information, including videos of events, that has played very well to the public. And so there is very, very strong support for the positions and policies that is being taken by the administration on this. And I think that has really emboldened the administration into really now standing up for the rights of the Philippines and asserting most especially the South Chinese arbitration, which the previous administration tried to hide under the rug. But now with the Marcos administration, you can see that at every possible opportunity, it is being raised, it is being asserted. And this has called the attention of other countries. And now we see many countries, not just the US, coming to the Philippines and offering moral support, issuing statements in support of the Philippine position, and offering assistance as well as capacity building and capability building. So I think you see that really playing out well as well with the public, because they see that it has indeed been effective. And now we have other countries that are more vocally supporting the Philippines' positions and its actions.
Thank you both. That was very helpful. Now, obviously, this is primarily a dispute between China and the Philippines, but the shadow of the United States is also looming large over this entire situation, with some in China blaming the U.S. for the tensions. And obviously, the U.S. is a treaty ally with the Philippines, which also makes this a little more complicated. So, Francis, turn to you. Can you just tell us a little bit about how this crisis at Second Thomas Shoal is affecting relationship between the United States and China, and what you might be seeing or hearing from both sides in terms of how this is resonating in the bilateral relationship?
We've been observing both negative and positive trends. Negative trends, of course, there's reiteration of the U.S. commitment based on the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. But this did not come up as a surprise to China. And it's up to the U.S. interpretation whether the use of the military-grade laser or the use of water cannons constitute armed attack on the Philippines, either military forces or public vessels that's covered by the treaty, that would trigger the treaty. Besides the routine pushbacks from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in rhetoric, so there wasn't much anything else. But a more severe challenge to the Chinese behavior in the Second Thomas Shoal, in the Chinese perspective, is the escort, not sending service vessels, but the escort in the air by the Poseidon, P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircrafts to escort some of these resupply missions ships to the area. That the Chinese sees this as a direct challenge to their sovereignty in the area. So these are negative. But positively, that we've seen the Biden-Xi summit last year in California, although there was not specific mentioning of the recent flare-ups in the Second Thomas Shoal. There was mentioning of the South China Sea dispute. But overall, it seems that based on the joint statement issued by the two leaders, the South China Sea dispute is no longer, it's still a significant issue, that's not to deny, but it's no longer the most prominent issue in the US-China relationship. And another positive trend is the resumption of the military-to-military exchanges that was suspended since the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So that was resumed last October or November during the Xiangshan Forum. The military-to-military exchanges between the two countries could help to build trust and work out, perhaps establish some standard operational procedures that could become very important at times of crisis.
Wonderful, thank you. Jay, I'll turn to you now to give us a little perspective of what this looks like from the Philippines in terms of the U.S. engagement on this issue, the implications of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and how the Philippines is viewing the relationship between the U.S. and China in the aftermath of the recent tensions.
Well, first of all, from the Philippine perspective, unfortunately, it starts off on the wrong foot, because the ghost of Scarborough Shoal in 2012 still looms large in the thinking about U.S. assistance and promises and the alliance itself. No? It's always there at the back of their minds, no? Especially in the security sector. So there will always be questions about the reliability of the United States based on those previous experiences. However, it is also recognized that in a way, both countries have realized that they do have certain common interests at stake here. No, freedom of navigation on the part of the Philippines is also works as well for freedom of navigation on the part of the United States. No, and that freedom of navigation is what allows the Philippines to be able to access these areas in the West Philippine Sea. So at least with the United States now, it's become more, in a way, more clear between the two parties as to what their commitments are. No? So even if the United States still maintains its neutrality over the claims to sovereignty over the various islands, when it comes to the entitlement of the Philippines, the EEZ and continental shelf, and to the legitimate activities it can undertake at sea, the United States has made it clear that they're taking the side of the Philippines with respect to those freedoms because it is a matter of common interest. The Mutual Defense Treaty has always been dragged into this discussion, no? And this is again based on historical baggage from the 1970s. But what has happened is that because of that refinement, shall we say, in the positions of the United States and the Philippines, they're now more clear as to it covering, no, as to the MDT extending coverage over Philippine troops, ships, and aircraft in the West Philippine Sea. So whether or not they're on the islands or near or at Second Thomas Shoal, it doesn't matter as long as what is involved is a Philippine ship or aircraft and Philippine troops, no? And they have made it clear that the defense relationship, no, the Mutual Defense Treaty will be available to provide protection and assistance, no, in case those ships, troops, or aircraft are actually subject to an armed attack. Now, of course, China has been careful to avoid engaging in activities that might be clearly interpreted to be an armed attack, and that's why we have water cannons and lasers. And I think Francis has also pointed that out, no, that they've basically used these methods so that it doesn't fall clearly within the coverage of that definition rather of armed attack and fall under the MDT. Now, nonetheless, it has led to better coordination and cooperation between the two countries, and that I think is what is making China nervous, really. The fact that the P8 of the US is monitoring activities from afar, no, it's not likely that it will intervene. But if there is an action that is taken that does qualify as an armed attack, then the MDT will apply, and the US will be obliged to take some actions to intervene, and that's probably the flashpoint that we're all concerned about. No? Now, if it were to escalate, how would the US respond? I think that the US has made it clear that insofar as units operating there at sea are concerned, there will be a response. If there is a call for assistance, they necessarily will respond to a call for assistance. And I think that's made it clear. The tricky thing there is whether that will lead to escalation, no? And that's where there is still a lot of ambiguity as to what kinds of crisis control mechanisms can be in place between the Philippines and China, between the US and China, and all the parties.
Terrific. Well, we are running low on time, but I want to give both of you a chance to make some final comments to address some of the issues that we haven't talked about yet. So I guess first, what should we be looking for in the months ahead? And also, are there any important issues that we should be thinking about to help us understand this issue that we haven't mentioned so far? So I guess any final comments or parting words from either one of you before we wrap up the conversation today? Francis, I'll start with you, and then Jay, we'll let you have the last word. Thanks.
I feel that China will continue to carry out its current strategy of utilizing paramilitary forces, especially the Coast Guard vessels and sometimes the armed fishing vessels, to assert its sovereignty and intercept, block the Filipino resupply ships, to eventually to force the Philippines to withdraw from the shoal. So as a result, this tactic will mean that will be sustaining a high frequency of these type of low intensity conflicts sometimes leading to a collision or injuries, but now not strong enough to trigger the defense treaty. So that's China's strategy going forward. Unless something drastic happens, or eventually that the Philippines, there have been talks that Philippines could have the option of running aground another ship near the shoal, but that might trigger the Chinese move in and seize control of the shoal entirely. Hopefully, so that would significantly escalated the tension in the area. Hopefully, even in that case, that cool minds will prevail, and like measured responses and restraint will prevail.
Wonderful. Jay?
Well, for me, I agree with Francis' assessment that China will continue to tighten the noose, so to speak. And then really, I see this as an opportunity to dislodge the Philippines from one very important position. However, the Philippines has also, in a way, seen the importance of the shoal, if not for its practical value, but because of its symbolic value. The loss of Second Thomas Shoal would be equivalent to a loss of the South China Sea arbitration, all the benefits that it lays down for the Philippines. And it also be indicative, it will be a symbol essentially of the loss of the EEZ in a way, because that's what we've been insisting, no? That our rights here are based on international law. So that would also be a huge blow now to the international rules-based order and the international law that small countries like the Philippines have placed great faith in. So because of that, the Philippines will continue and will do what it can to maintain its supply lines to Second Thomas Shoal. And yeah, that is the potential source of tensions and escalation and crisis. I agree that we hope that cooler heads will prevail. The thing is, from a purely practical perspective, no, the Second Thomas Shoal, the ship there poses absolutely no threat to anyone. So even on the part of China, clearly it has a symbolic value. They want to dislodge it to satisfy some political objective and not really not much else, no, given the overwhelming amount of forces that they have in the area. So it's going to be a battle of symbols in a way, and that probably is a lot more unpredictable in a way than the usual kinds of conflicts that we see.
Well, this has been a terrific discussion. I know we could go on for a lot longer, but we are out of time for today's event. So I just want to close by saying a huge thank you to our speakers, Francis Wong and Jay Batong-Bakal, for their excellent work in helping us understand these recent developments at Second Thomas Shoal, but also putting what we've seen in the news this week into a broader historical and strategic context to help us make sense of what's happening. So on behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us for today's event, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks again.